People, you may or may not know about the news about the Karl Marx's gravestone being vandalized recently, and apparently this happens a number of times. Okay, I have two things to say about that. One, to paraphrase Chris Rock, I ain't saying they should have done it, but I understand. And number two, it's important to not be a hypocrite, okay? If you have double standards about something, then that means, well, you have bad principles or something. You're being a hypocrite. I'll say the same thing about Karl Marx's grave that I've said about the Confederate statues. Number one, you don't have the right to just go and deface public property like that if it is indeed public property. You don't have the right to deface anybody's property, period, whether it's private or public, unless it's your own, okay? Number two, I understand if you think that it's an affront to society and you want to get rid of it and etc. Okay, but go about it the right way. Don't destroy it. Go about it the legal way, the right way, or whatever. Maybe it should be taken down, just like the Confederate statues, and placed in a museum. I mean, maybe not. Maybe it should just be kept right where it is as a piece of history. But, if you want to, if you're really against it being displayed in public, well, you have the right to at least try to legally have it taken down, replaced, put into a museum, or whatever. You don't have the right to just go and destroy it. Again, I kind of understand, but yeah, go about it the right way. How many of you out there were okay with the destruction and vandalism of the Confederate statues, but you're outraged about this thing happening to Karl Marx's grave? How many of you out there were outraged by the vandalism of the Confederate statues, but you're okay with this? Now, I can understand, because part of me is like, yeah, fuck Karl Marx, good, let it happen. And like I said at the beginning, I can understand, part of me is like, woohoo, fuck Karl Marx, I totally get it. But, there are things that are more important than what I want and what I like, and, things like principle, fairness, and avoiding hypocrisy. So again, how many of you out there, think about it, how many of you out there are hypocrites and applying a double standard when it comes to the Confederate statues on one hand and the Karl Marx grave on the other hand? Now folks, I want to invite you to scroll down and click on the links below to see our older videos. One's called Monumental Madness and the other is called More Monumental Madness. And with this in mind, many of us don't know, I didn't know until I looked into this. Do you know that the Weather Underground, it's a left-wing terrorist group, kind of like Antifa. Did you know that they tried to destroy, or they partially destroyed, the famous statue by Rodin called The Thinker? And also, I want to take this opportunity to yet again pay respects to Larry Grathwohl, who infiltrated that group. And you may know that Larry Grathwohl is the father of Lindsay Grathwohl, who you may have seen in a number of our videos, who is still out there fighting against terrorists like the Weather Underground, but now called Antifa and BAMN and etc. And now let's have a look at some of our past videos about this stuff.
In Fahrenheit 451, basically because everybody's offended by something, people then live in a world where there is no literature. And, okay, this was written long ago, so it's not like they had the internet either. There's just nothing to read on a screen, in a book, in a magazine, nothing. Because it's all been eradicated. Everybody lives in communities where everything's made out of flame-proof stuff. Everything except for the contraband, that is. Paper books, magazines, literature, basically. And it's illegal to have literature because it's horrifying. The only thing you're allowed to do is to watch your television, which is ever-present because in the future, in this dystopia, there are television screens on every surface, or every vertical surface anyway, of everybody's dwellings, and so everybody's pretty much hypnotized by what is more or less reality TV. It's just gossip. Things that do not matter. No issues, no news, no truth, no wisdom, no philosophy, no thought provocation, nothing like that. And firemen in the story 451, they are not people who put out fires, they're people who use fire to destroy the evil literature that they sometimes find. The tone is somewhat like that of Nazi Germany, where, say, people are hiding Jews in their attics or in their basement, except it's literature and not human beings. And you have people who are encouraged to tell on anybody who they suspect of having literature in their dwelling, because they will be snuffed out and, say, sent away. For even having it in the first place. And what I'm getting at, folks, is just like in 1984 and other dystopian novels, although it's accentuated in this one by a lot, we now see an effort to employ erasure of the past because it offends people. Erasure of, say, facts, truth, documents, things in museums, taking books off of shelves,
Yeah, and
because they're offensive to somebody. Well, actually, no. It's never because they're offensive to somebody. It's only because they're offensive to one side. I should reiterate. Except for Muslims, they're past. Muslims could be right-wing, and that's okay, because they're brown skin in the mind of a lot of people, so they get a free pass. But other than Muslims, it's always a left-wing bias.
For monumental.
In light of all the statues being damaged by Antifa, BLM, BAMN, and so on, all the monumental madness, this hysteria over sculptures in the wake of Charlottesville, and so on, I'd like to remind people of another group that engaged in just this sort of activity decades ago when they partially destroyed one of the most iconic sculptures ever. The far-left activist group turned terrorist group, the Weathermen, later renamed the Weather Underground to be more tolerant of other genders, among other things, blew up government buildings.
At 1 minute before 1 o'clock this morning, the switchboard at the Capitol received a phone call. A man's voice said a bomb would go off in the building in half an hour. At 1:30 in the morning, it did, in a small, unmarked restroom on the ground floor of the Senate side, next to a barber shop and near several small offices, including one committee hearing room. Credit for the Capitol bombing was claimed in a letter received by the Associated Press today, signed by the Weather Underground.
Ho Chi Minh's birthday was also marked in Washington. A bomb exploded early this morning in the Pentagon, and left-wing terrorists telephoned newspapers to say they were responsible. Stephen Gear reports.
The explosion destroyed one of the Pentagon's 140 women's restrooms and blasted out a wall on the 4th floor. No one was injured. The explosion came at 1 a.m., just moments after the Pentagon's duty officer received a warning based on one of a number of calls to newspapers, one of which said the Pentagon would be bombed in celebration of Ho Chi Minh's birthday.
People calling themselves members of the Weather Underground last night planted bombs in federal office buildings in Washington and Oakland, California.
That other bomb threat was a dramatic one at a military induction center in Oakland, California today.
At midday, the Associated Press got a phone call from a man saying he was with the Weather Underground and that bombs would explode at the Departments of Interior and Agriculture and the Smithsonian before the day was out.
A federal grand jury in Detroit today charged the 13 top leaders of the Weathermen with plotting to bomb public buildings in Chicago, Detroit, New York, and Berkeley, California. The Weathermen are the militant faction of the Students for a Democratic Society. Only one of the 13 is now in custody.
The Weathermen took their name from the line in the song Subterranean Homesick Blues, where Bob Dylan sings, "You don't need a weatherman to know it's the wind blows." By the way, in this video, Bob Dylan and Allen Ginsberg, the famous beat poet, who is back there playing a Hasidic rabbi, are in Greenwich Village here. I could say from personal experience, it's a cute little area of New York City, and it's basically New York City's version of the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco. It's sort of a hippie, hipster, freak central kind of place. And this is the same neighborhood in which the Weather Underground, ironically, accidentally blew up their hideout. They were stockpiling explosives. Who knows what victims they may have killed with that dynamite had they not blown themselves up. A couple of them died in that explosion, by the way. Besides the more obvious similarities between this terrorist group and the terrorist groups Antifa, BAMN, and etc., there are some less obvious ones. The Weather Underground's expressed intention to exist was to take down the US government, quote, by any means necessary, unquote. Of course, the current group BAMN stands for by any means necessary, which is a reference to Malcolm X's use of this phrase.
By any means necessary.
By which he meant violence. And then there's the similarity between them of damaging statues.
The Weathermen fanned the flames just before the days of rage by blowing up a statue honoring Chicago policemen.
Now we have an out-and-out defiant gesture by groups that have come in here to upset the city, and we wonder now what'll happen. Now it's a statue. Will it be a policeman performing his duty tomorrow, or what?
One of the most famous statues ever, Auguste Rodin's The Thinker. The Journal for the American Institute for Conservation, Volume 37, Number 2, published 1998, included this article titled, 25 Years After the Bomb, Maintaining Cleveland's The Thinker, by Bruce Christman, which reads, quote, in 1970, the museum's thinker was blown up by radical protesters, unquote. Then, in Section 3, titled Explosion March 24, 1970, it reads, quote, in the early morning hours of March 24, 1970, dynamite was placed between the legs of the thinker. The results were devastating. Then they refer to Figure 3, which is this here. The base and the lower part of the legs were annihilated, and the remaining sculpture was knocked off its pedestal. The thinker lay face down, apparently contemplating hell much more directly. You see, when Rodin initially made this, and also the Lovers? No, the Kiss, and other sculptures, these were all going to be part of one group, which was to be depictions of scenes from Dante's Inferno. The thinker was supposed to be Dante himself, looking down into hell and contemplating this all. Later on, Auguste Rodin dissociated these pieces and made them more independent pieces. The blast sent pieces of bronze flying, causing damage to the building approximately 20 yards away. The bronze doors of the museum were dented, the marble columns were chipped. This damage can be seen to this day. Pieces of bronze were even found on the roof. According to the Cleveland Police Department, this act of terrorism was conducted by a radical weatherman group operating in Cleveland. Members of the group later moved to New York City, where they were killed by making explosives, unquote. You can see a lot of this destruction on your screen right there. And by the way, yes, that is actor Dustin Hoffman right there. He lived in the neighborhood at the time. It is a very high-rent area, and famous people have been living there since the 60s. As the Cleveland Museum of Art says, no one was arrested.
I brought up the subject of what's going to happen after we take over the government. We become responsible then for administrating, 250 million people. And there was no answers. No one had given any thought to economics. How are you going to clothe and feed these people? The only thing that I could get was that they expected that the Cubans and the North Vietnamese and the Chinese and the Russians would all want to occupy different portions of the United States. They also believed that their immediate responsibility would be to protect against what they called the counter-revolution. And they felt that this counter-revolution could best be guarded against by creating and establishing re-education centers in the Southwest. Where we would take all the people who needed to be re-educated into the new way of thinking and teach them how things were going to be. I ask, well, what is going to happen to those people that we can't re-educate, that are die-hard capitalists? And the reply was that they'd have to be eliminated. And when I pursued this further, they estimated that they would have to eliminate 25 million people in these re-education centers. And when I say eliminate, I mean kill. 25 million people. I want you to imagine sitting in a room with 25 people, most of which have graduate degrees from Columbia and other well-known educational centers, and hear them figuring out the logistics for the elimination of 25 million people. And they were dead serious.
The Weather Underground, a far-left terrorist organization that wanted to end the U.S. government by any means necessary, kind of like Antifa. They used explosives, kind of like Antifa, although the magnitude is certainly not the same, at least not yet. They hurt their own, which Antifa often does. But what matters for the purpose and the point of this video is that both groups think that they have the special right, the elite privilege, to destroy things that are not theirs. Also, it's important to learn from history, make comparisons, perceive patterns, and hopefully gain the insight and the wisdom to learn from mistakes and to evolve. So, folks, what do you think about all of this?